Please pray with me. God of grace and God of hope, as we begin this Advent season, let us remember that we journey in company with you, the source of all that is good, lasting, and true. Meet us where we are. Meet us in our need. Bathe us in your grace, we pray, with a spirit of expectation. May God's people say, amen. Our invitation on this first Sunday of Advent and throughout this Advent season is to come as we are. Come with our stress. Come with our worries. Come with our anxiousness. Come with our hopes, our dreams, our gratitude. Come with our brokenness. Come with our longings. And know that whatever we bring with us this Advent season, what we bring and who we are is enough. That who we are and what we bring is enough. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 6 through 7, we hear these words. While they were there, Mary and Joseph, in Bethlehem to be registered for a mandatory census, the time came for the baby to be born. And Mary gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloth, in swaddling clothes, literally meaning in rags, and laid him in a manger. And the word manger is a feeding trough, the place where the cows and the sheep came to feed. They laid their child in this humble setting. And for that night, it was enough. They went to the innkeeper first, and the innkeeper didn't have any room. He had nowhere to put this mother about to give birth. And so he said, this is the best that I can offer, a bale of hay, a cover over your head, a feeding trough to lay your child when that child comes. Is that okay? And the story of Christmas tells us that it was enough. What do you and I offer to the Christ child this Advent season? What do we bring in who we are and what we have to offer? And do we believe that who we are and what we have to lay before the Christ child is enough? It's been said, argue for your limitations long enough, and sure enough, they're yours. In the Christmas story, we are called to set aside our perceived limitations and to look at ourselves through the eyes of the Christ child, full of possibilities, full of giftedness, full of potential. Do we believe that to be true? And who are those who, like the Holy Family, struggle to find a place in today's world that is safe and good enough? We think of Family Promise that serves homeless families on the North Shore looking for housing security. Will they have enough? We think of undocumented neighbors here in Beverly in Massachusetts and across the country, worrying about their future and what they will be able to provide for their children. We think of our neighbors on the southern border waiting to find a better future. Will they have enough? We think, too, of children who are often overlooked by society, who are most vulnerable when families struggle for one reason or another. Will they find enough? Will we as a church, as the body of Christ, offer enough to one another and to those in need beyond our walls? Do we believe that within our gathered community we have enough to offer to make a difference, to bring healing and hope? Do we argue for our limitations, or do we argue for our potential to make this world a little more kind and a little more just? I think of a church I served when I was a young guy, in my 20s, great head of hair, a couple of pant sizes ago. And I was a young pastor just starting out. And that church had no children. In fact, that church hadn't had a child in its midst for about 10 years. They had given away their high chairs because they no longer expected to have any children. They argued for their limitations. But slowly, over several years that we served and worshiped together, God began to bring the children into our midst. And in that church, along this wall, Covenant Baptist Church, Wickliffe, Ohio, there was a plate glass window. Plate glass that just covered the length of that wall. And in the winter, it would have condensation. Thank you. You're my wing person, Julie. And the moisture would fill and cloud that window. And the children couldn't help themselves. They would go up and they would draw pictures. They would draw their names, smiley faces. They would make up stories, and this wall, this plate glass window in the church would be filled with all the art of the children. Now, there was a woman in the church, a lovely person named Ruth, who would have made a great Marine instructor. And Ruth had an opinion on just about everything. And Ruth didn't think it was dignified for those children to be writing on that plate glass window. That's not what church is for. Church is for the children to be settled and to sit and to be quiet, just like adults. And so one day, Ruth went up and she just kind of abruptly marched those children out of the church and gave them a lecture out in the hallway, saying that's not how children are to behave. It's not dignified. Now, watching this was a very dear friend of Ruth named Esther. Esther, like Ruth, was in her mid-70s. And Esther had a heart for the children because she remembered what it was like when her mom died when she was just a little girl, and of how her dad had difficulty coping. And so she and her sister were shuttled from family to family, all having challenges of their own. And these two children, at 5 and 7, Esther and her younger sister, couldn't find a place where they felt like they were accepted. And so Esther watched with tears in her eyes as her friend Ruth marched the children out of the church. She remembered what it was like to be an outsider, to not fit in, to not be accepted. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever been that kid in gym class who was the last one to be chosen? You ever feel like as an adult you don't fit in? You sometimes wonder whether God's love is enough for you. Jesus, however, had a heart for those who were most vulnerable. In Matthew 25, verse 40, he says, "Whatever you do unto the most vulnerable of my sisters and brothers, you do it for me." When you see someone hungry and you feed them, when they're naked and you clothe them, when you visit them in prison, it's as if you are doing it to me. Where did Jesus' heart for the most vulnerable, the outcast, come from? Perhaps he grew up with stories from his parents of when he was a baby and how he was born homeless. Or perhaps he was brought up with stories or could remember himself of how his parents fled the evil King Herod and fled and lived for the first 6 or 7 years of his life in a refugee camp in Egypt. Perhaps it was those stories that shaped his heart, his sense of inclusion, his sense of welcome. And it's how Jesus looked at the children, too. Verse Matthew 19:13, "Then little children were brought to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and to pray for them. But the disciples rebuked the parents, those who had brought the children." So why did the disciples rebuke the children? Because In keeping with my friend Ruth, they were noisy. They were unruly. They were children. And Jesus said in response in verse 14, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And he placed his hands upon the heads of the children, and he blessed them. We imagine Jesus placing his hands and blessing the children. We imagine Jesus placing his hands on the heads of the homeless that others walk by right here in Beverly and bless them. We imagine Jesus going to the addict, to the alcoholic, and placing his hands upon their heads and blessing them. Jesus going to the broken and the undocumented, the abused, the bedridden, the violated, the forgotten, and placing his hands upon our heads and saying, "I love you, I cherish you, and my love for you is enough." We all have something going on. I've been a pastor for a long time. And what I've learned is this: nobody has their act completely together. Certainly not me. My grandmother used to say, "We are all beautiful train wrecks." And when I was a kid, that didn't make sense to me. I'd say, "Grandma, how can you be a beautiful train wreck?" And as I've gotten older, I've come to understand her wisdom. That we all have wounds and brokenness and struggles. Some of us hide it better than others. Some of us have our act together better than others of us at any given moment in time. But we all are wounded because that's what it means to be a human being. And Jesus, this Christ child, places his hands upon your head and my head and says, "My love for you is enough." So Esther thought about her dear friend Ruth for a few weeks. And what's that word again, Julie, on the windows? Yeah, that word. It's hard for me to say. So the windows fogged up again, and no child wrote his or her name for weeks because Ruth was watching. So one day Esther got up when the prelude music was playing, and she walked over to the plate glass window, and she wrote her name. And then she drew a picture of herself at 7 and her sister at 5, and she drew a big heart around her 7-year-old self and her 5-year-old sister, and she placed a cross above that heart. And then she motioned to a couple of the children who were watching her. And they walked up, and she invited them to write their name and their story. Ruth knew when she was up against a true adversary, and she loved Esther, and she knew Esther's story from her childhood. And so a few weeks later, hand in hand, Esther and Ruth walked up to the plate glass window as people were gathering for worship, and they wrote their name. Mr. Rogers simply says this: "You were a child too, once." Elizabeth Wren, a social worker on the North Shore who works with vulnerable families, writes, "Children aren't badly behaved adults. They're children. In a world built for adults, it's when we start to see children at fault for not fitting in an adult's world just right, that we get into trouble. What would it look like," she asks, "if the world saw children as children?" The radical truth of the Bible is that God chose to enter into the world not as a conquering king, not as a wise sage, but as a helpless, vulnerable child. Born to poor, unwed parents, under the threat of a sadistic king named Herod, and who spent the first 6 to 7 years of his life in a refugee camp in a foreign land. That's why this Advent season we remind one another that in God's kingdom we come as we are, with all our vulnerability, with all our strength, with all our doubts, with all our belief, with all our hopes, and with all of our dreams. And we bring it all before the Christ child, who offers us the gift of grace to remind us that in God's kingdom, God's love, God's mercy, God's tenderness is offered to all of us. This wonderful, beautiful gathering of train wrecks. And to know that you are good enough, just the way we are. That is the good news. Thanks be to God. And may God's people say, amen.